Dear teachers, educators, and everyone working in or curious about education, welcome to the AI Perspectives podcast. My name is Matt, and for the past 7 years, I worked as an educational consultant, trainer, and teacher of skills-based courses at Erasmus University Rotterdam. And to be honest, at first I ignored the topic of AI for longer than I care to admit. But that changes here. In this podcast series, I invite you to join me as we explore the role of generative AI in education from different perspectives. Not with a hype or fear, but with curiosity, reflection, and real teaching and classroom experiences. Today's theme is that of generative AI and use it in writing, viewed through the lens of the teacher. We'll talk about what happens when AI moves from something that students secretly use to something that deliberately teachers design for in their education. To explore this perspective, I'm joined by a special guest, Chris Müller, who is a senior lecturer at Life Sciences at Erasmus University College. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
How are you today?
Happy. And back into teaching since the break. First time I taught a class again, and it's been fun. Yeah.
Great to hear. Great to be back in education.
Yes.
Students excited after break.
A mix of excitement and they have to really get back into it because they start a new course with new people. So they're also in a sort of a new environment. Considering the circumstances, it was a good session.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, happy to have you here. Now, unlike me, you were very fast in implementing AI back in the day. And to share a sneak peek, Chris made use of AI mandatory in his classes, which I find fascinating. But before we get into this, I want to use a little time machine.
Sure.
And moving ourselves back in November 2022, where ChatGPT made this big splash and everybody was aware of this tool and what it can do. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, in that period, how did you react to the AI when you first saw it, both as a person, but also as a teacher?
So I think my first point of contact was a buzz on Reddit. I hadn't sort of directly heard about this, but the buzz was undeniable. And it took me a while to realize that this wasn't going away because, Reddit or social media can be really hypey. This took too long to go away, so I decided to check it out and take a look. And when you have to set up an account for something, I usually go, I don't think so, but I was too curious. When I first tried it out, everything that I read on the web seemed to pan out. So my first reaction was a very quick change from, oh, that's awesome, to, oh dear, we're going to have to change everything.
So it felt like real, right? It was true.
Yeah,
the hype was true.
Yeah, and also because I think on Reddit, the connection to education or writing was already made. So I think that's when I realized I have to find out what this is and see if this is also going to come to us.
As that happens, how quick you were to adapt it in your teaching?
So this was the end of our Christmas sort of block quad. So when I found it out, we were on break. I think the first time people in the Netherlands started using it was for the Sinterklaas poems. That's when I saw people adapting it here. But over the break, I tried it a few times and realized this is going to be an issue. And I decided to immediately, after the break, the course that I was teaching right after the break, so this is January, February 23, to incorporate it. I asked our senior or our educational director, could I try it? And at this point, they were like, yeah, sounds interesting, give it a shot.
Right. So right away, implementing it into your
First course I taught after the winter break. That was, we put it in.
Great. I mean, I think that's very fast implementation.
In hindsight, yeah. I mean, I figured this is something everyone's going to do because there's no going around it. But it's not been as broadly adapted yet.
I'm curious here. How did you see similar reaction in your colleagues and your fellow teachers? Or was there more hesitant? Or how?
Hesitant, yeah. I think, because I asked a few of my colleagues, have you seen this? Have you heard about this? And they heard about it. And then, but they hadn't bothered to set up an account or hadn't gotten around to it. for whatever reason. So I came to their desk with a laptop, and I knew what it did to the topics that I knew something about. So it sounded really convincing, but I didn't know anything about philosophy or virology. So some of my colleagues, I asked them, okay, ask me a question to have it write about. And I'll hit enter right in front of you. And when they saw the letters appear and the material it produced, they had this sort of
uncomfortable laugh.
Yeah, a little bit, but didn't immediately lead to everybody adopting it in their classes. But the sense of, oh crap, I'm not sure if I can say that, but that's kind of the feeling. I think.
What are we going to do now, right? And I remember in that period, I mean, that I think continues up to this point, there was quite uncertainty, right? What is the policy? How should we compromise?
Oh,
How did you navigate that?
I mean, I don't think the idea that we have to put this into policy was, I don't know how long that took. I think maybe at least a year until we realized everybody has to find a way to deal with this. Either change your assignments. I mean, everyone was sort of figuring out their own way of dealing with this at that stage. Because I think everybody felt that for each assignment and for each course, it poses a different threat, if you will, or it has a different implication, different ways of testing. I mean, if you're testing with an exam, there's not much you need to do. But if most of the assignment material is writing, for example, then you have to do something.
So I want to understand the course where you made it mandatory to use the AI. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is the assignment and what role the AI played there?
So this course had an experiment that the students needed to perform and then write an empirical paper about it. So they had to write a journal paper about an experiment they performed. So this is an introduction, a method section, results, discussion, conclusion, as if they were researchers. And I told them, write the introduction with the help of AI. So you have to. But also, I'm going to give you points for the content of what you produce, so the actual text that is the introduction, but also points for a reflection on how you used it. And I structured the reflection in, for example, okay, you have to give me the prompts you used and whether you use the output of those prompts or not and why, and find at least 3 factual errors and tell me how you fix those.
Yeah, so you totally ask them to use the AI, but also reflect and analyze or provide you the steps how they use it as well.
Yeah, and I think key in hindsight was to also force them to find errors. Because the text as it appears to you doesn't seem like it's wrong unless you're an expert. But if you're a student, you're not necessarily an expert yet. So you might be, fooled. And I think that's the part that I've been using in all the courses where I can.
Quite insightful. I'm curious. You mentioned already that when you introduced it, some students were a little bit more hesitant.
Yeah.
How did you see in that time student reaction? Were there some students that didn't want to use AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. They all ended up using it because it was an assignment for duos. So I think maybe if it was a solo assignment, maybe some students would have resisted or maybe even make up the reflection. But they all ended up using it, but some with gusto and some with some hesitance, because I don't think they saw it as something that they needed to look to the future for, or that they needed to incorporate, for the years coming later.
Look back at this first implementation, right? You are sort of pioneering right after the ChatGPT and the AI came. Would you do something differently if you would introduce this again? Or maybe you did some changes throughout the period?
Well, so in some assignments, it's not as easy to do the same thing. So my big issue with a lot of large language models is that they are not built to be factually correct. So if an assignment requires that, it's easy to use this approach. But for some courses, we have like a poster, for example. And poster content or formatting or other aspects you can also use AI for, but it's less of an iterative process. So a reflection makes a little less sense. So I've implementing this mandatory component has changed a little bit depending on the assignments.
So I understood that in your assignments, it's mandatory to use AI in introduction or a small part.
Yeah.
But what if they use AI in everything? Is there something that you check? Do you have any rubric, or how do you instruct students on this?
Well, I now very clearly say it's just for the introduction. So that's where they have explicit permission. Our policy at UC now is that there's a list of options, like levels at which you can use it, and course coordinators will show which level is allowed. And deviation from that is only at the explicit instruction of a course coordinator. So as such, I tell them it's just the introduction. I have no way of knowing for sure that they don't use it for other things. But for our bachelor theses, for example, I'm sure it's being used there, even though it's very much not allowed for any part of the process there. But it turns out that most of the time where I suspect it, it's also the content isn't fantastic. So those we've been more or less making do with grading it on the merit of the content.
Yeah.
Because if people use it in a way where they're just copying literally the output, it tends to be a disjointed, generic sounding piece. And you are assessed on your academic voice, you're assessed on coherency. So we have tools in place for that. And the same is for the assignments that I have in my courses. If it's used somewhere else, it's usually, even if I suspect it, I don't check it because I don't think it makes sense to police it. But often it's clear, or that's the thing. Now that it exists, if something sounds generic and uses very old references, it's tempting to think it's AI, even though it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it's kind of false positive.
Exactly. But in those cases, I rate it on merit or on content, and that also works. The other thing is, for the musicology experiments, they have to design those. They have to design an experiment and come up with something that hasn't been done yet. So it's not like they can use stuff that AI or LLMs were trained on to do something that they just came up with. So often it's novel enough to not be that helpful, and it's a discussion, it's statistical analyses. So
musicology will be the course that you're teaching.
That's the one I'm grading stuff for now, and that's the one I think I've had the most papers or the most iterations where this has been a component.
When you ask students to use AI in the introduction part, do you provide them with any support in terms of what tools to use, what tools you recommend, how to use them, or is it more just use it and figure it out?
Use it and figure it out. Yeah. And they're assessed on how they explain how they used it and figured it out. So in the end, they're also allowed to edit, right? It's not like they have to copy the exact output and hope that it sounds good. They can use it and edit, build on it, change it. So they're free to use it at the level that they like, but I don't tell them how to do it. I feel like they could tell me better than I can tell them.
When you look at those responses from students, like their reflections, right, on using AI, do you see differences in skills of how students are able to pick the AI tools or use the AI tools?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was asked to give a workshop on prompting during an AI Awareness Week we hosted last year. And in preparing it, I realized there's not much that I can teach students in prompting, but I wanted to focus on fact-checking. It's kind of my thing. But in the workshop, I showed them, just as an example for prompting, because we did talk a little bit about some basic strategies. I showed them I showed them two styles of prompting, like two extremes. And those were examples from real courses. One where people said in 3 lines, write me an introduction about this. And then the output was what you expect. Suboptimal. and full of factual errors. So that was one example. And in terms of difference in level, there was another paper in that same class where the prompt was 1.5 pages long. It included references, suggestions as to how to use those references. Basically, half of the introduction the prompt was as long as half the introduction.
So very elaborate.
Very elaborate, very detailed, almost, you could use half of that to be the introduction. Still contain factual errors. So yeah, there's a big level, and I think it reflects how much time people wanted to invest.
Yeah, so even with great prompts, there's still errors.
Still errors, yeah. And I think you need to be inoculated for that. That's the thing I think makes the most sense. There's no point to tell students not to use it, but more of, especially if it has to be factual, that you realize that something that sounds true and you don't know the topic that well, there's a good chance that there's nonsense in there. Yeah. And when I showed that big prompt in the class, the workshop, as a few students asked, but wouldn't it just make sense to then do it by yourself without AI?
Wouldn't it be faster?
Yeah. And then I had them do a little exercise. So I gave them a couple of bullet points as to what requirements there was for a short text. I said, the text you'll have with whatever AI you want to use in a minute or less. But then take 15 minutes to fact check that. And then put all the responses on a shared digital wall, and we'll look at what you found in terms of errors. 15 minutes later, we check. There's no errors. Not that there weren't any, but the student said, we don't know this topic so well, so we don't really know what to look for. And I realized that was a better purpose of the workshop than I realized.
The very valuable lesson here.
Yeah, for them, but also I realized that if you don't know your topic, and ChatGPT or whatever you use talks to you about it and it sounds convincing, then it's tempting not to want to check that.
Yeah.
And if you nudge people to do that with points, in this case, for the assignment, they realize there's a lot to improve.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from teachers, the common concern about use of AI, generative AI, is that students lose this ability to critically think or critically write or evaluate. Yeah. But I think what I understood, what you're trying to teach students is to actually critically look at your use of AI, and in that way to still maintain this critical thinking, critical writing skills. Yeah,
I think it's very good at writing, but not so good at, it's not thinking. And as long as students realize that the thinking is for them and the writing, you can have help. We've had help in writing for ages, spell checkers. Sometimes I'm typing an email with a content that I've typed before, and it feels really silly now to manually, letter by letter, construct a message. Because in my mind, the whole message is there already. And to make it a reality so somebody else can read it, I have to press buttons. And I think if it takes over that part, that's fine. But when it gives you something, it sounds like it's doing both jobs for you. Is there a movie where there's like a science fiction, a futuristic, let's say technology that you think, that's what we need? Because usually it's pretty dystopian.
Yeah.
Right?
We have actually a book here on the table. I'm not sure if it's visible on the camera, of a Blade Runner, right?
Good example.
And that's actually where the AI progressed, or the robots, the humanoid androids that are indistinguishable from humans.
Yeah.
You have to go through certain procedure to see if that's... So if you reach that level, what's the difference?
Will there be a point, do you think, where instead of reading a piece of text or seeing a photo or a movie or a piece of music, instead of those, and you wonder, did a human make this? Will there be a point where you encounter somebody at a desk that you need to talk to, and you're going to wonder, is this a live person? Are we gonna see that in our lifetime?
I think so.
Really?
Well, maybe towards the end of our lifetime. But if you look at it, I already struggle sometimes to distinguish whether the writing, right, whether it's like a chatbot or written text was written by human or AI.
Yeah.
In many cases, I wouldn't be able to tell with confidence. And sometimes when I feel it is AI, it is actually not, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So we just need like a phase in this animatronics to actually bring it to life.
And is it? I mean, for me, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I would prefer, for example, music that's made by people. Even though the synthesizer came and everyone was like, "Oh, that sounds like everything else," but then they built on that, and synthesizers aren't, they're everywhere and they're normal. Same with audio editing or recording, but still, if music is generated completely by AI, I don't want to like it. I want to tell myself I can tell the difference, and I want to disavow anything that's made by AI because it's not real.
So then what you value in the music is this like human components that's created rather than just pure objective.
Yeah, but what if you heard a piece of music and you thought, oh, this is amazing, it's the best I've ever heard, and you're not sure if it's AI or not? Would you want to find out?
That's a good question. I would say...
Or do you care?
I think I wouldn't care as much.
Really?
If I would enjoy it, right? I actually listened to also a few AI songs and I quite like them. But I would be concerned, certainly, right? Because then I think one of the limitations of AI, and it also translates to writing or any creative process, what you said earlier, that it just sort of like regurgitates all human knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Rather than providing something new. There was this interesting book I read as a kid.
What if you haven't heard it yet? So it's not new, but it's new to you.
Yeah, then in that case,
fine.
It seems fine. But I would be worried then about the future of music, right? Because then if there are no more musicians, then all music will be just recreation of the past music.
Yeah.
And the book that I was mentioning, The Planet of the Apes, the original book, not the movies, I read it as a teenager. And there's this interesting question or situation there that's that the apes in that society that became sort of like intelligent, they don't have ability to think originally. They only rewrite the old books. They sort of like, so there's no real progress of society. It's just like maintaining the same level of information. So the new innovation is rare.
So they don't write. They do read and write, but they
but it's usually just, it's almost first time I've learned about how the Gen AI works, it very much reminded me of that book. That's it's not necessarily generating new creative things. It's just revamping and mixing around what was there before rather than coming with new things.
Yeah, and if it does come up with something, I mean, it can seem new because there's no way you can have read everything. Or have heard every piece of music, or have seen every painting. Let's say.
So for your normal life, I think it might be fine. But for the future of humanity, that might be the like the plateau, the ceiling that we cannot overcome.
I read somewhere that kids growing up now, when they're like mine are 6 and 9, but 10 years from now, they will have been around AI generated everything's for a decade or more. Somebody said this is a good thing because it means that they will not attach as much value to nonsense or to things that are like low effort stuff on the internet because everything is fake. And I've thought to myself, maybe, but if they've never seen like the shift or the change, maybe they'll just enjoy that for what it is.
Yeah, just accept it.
The way we enjoy we enjoyed the things that we considered original and are now sort of struggling with what do we think of stuff that's being made artificially. Because there's so much that was already artificial and that we accepted, especially I think in music. I remember when we spoke before, we talked about art and whether it's important that something's original.
Yeah.
And you just said, and I was trying to hide that I was a little shocked, but maybe I'm just shocked with my own prejudice, that you wouldn't mind if music, for example, is done by AI. If you just enjoy it, then why not?
Yeah.
I'm still shocked.
I think it depends on what situation we're talking about, right? If it's like background music to
in a supermarket. I think that's when AI would shine. I think
Yeah, for
that's
example,
already where
I
it
wouldn't
was.
care as long as it's like pleasant, enjoyable music.
Yeah.
That's great.
No,
But
I
maybe
agree.
if I go to the concert, right, I wouldn't pay for AI generated music to
Exactly.
see the computer performing.
Well, if they had actual robots playing,
Or maybe that might be
there is a
interesting.
robot orchestra. I think that is literally a metal band because they're all made of metal and they have all these robots playing real instruments. So the instruments are totally real, but all the intricately built robots are what's playing them.
Yeah.
That I would pay to see because you can tell a lot of effort went into that.
Yeah. There are some humans behind it to build it and
Yeah,
perform it.
like scores of humans making that. I think that's what would worry me if it's about AI and art, for example, paintings or other things. It's always been this thing that a human made it
Yeah.
with some level of some degree of help, maybe of tools or things like that. But this just seems like, I don't know, like I don't know, like I guess this feels like cheating. Speaking as a musician in a band who's just, take 2 years to make a record, and there's a lot of effort that goes into it, no AI at any stage, I'm sure we could have made this record in a weekend.
Yeah.
If it's just AI. And it really feels like, on the one hand, it feels like, why are you still doing it this way? But I guess it's because the goal isn't the end result.
Oh, it's like the process, right? And then also this unique product that was generated by a human, and the struggle and the creative process inside.
Yeah. And that's the value. And the same applies to learning. I think for people fixated on grades and passing a course, getting a stamp of approval, the end result is what tends to seem like the most important thing.
Yeah.
Like I handed this thing in, and it has all the hallmarks that you require. So we're done here, right? Whereas you didn't go through the process mentally of making that, meaning that whole change that it instills in you, that doesn't happen. Which I think that's what we need to figure out, how to maintain that.
Yeah, how to train, right, the human mind, so we actually still learning and progressing rather than just stagnating.
Yeah, and if I can't really answer why I think that's important, but I think it's because that's what humans have been doing forever, and we should keep doing it.
Yeah. But I think for that you need also challenge, right? Because if things are too easy, then we don't learn as well, right?
Yeah.
So you have to struggle a bit. That's why I like what you said, that you not only ask them to generate that part, but you ask them to reflect, to find mistakes. So that's the struggle where the learning comes from.
Yeah, and that changes you as a human, like handing something in. I always asked myself, or I wanted to ask the students, okay, so you're studying to be a pastry chef.
Yeah.
How would you feel about your diploma if instead of making that croissant yourself, you go to Albert Heijn or, let's say, generic supermarket, and you buy one and you hand that in and you pass the course with something you bought in a store? Would you be proud? I think at that point it's easy to say, no, you wouldn't be proud of that.
I think nobody would, right? It's just you feel internally that, okay, that wasn't
But you passed
mine.
the course. So you have your, master pâtissier degree now. And all you know is how to go get them at the supermarket.
But then that shows you also the value of the assessment, right? That it needs to be done in a way that's...
Yeah.
These things can be either prevented or discouraged
in
some way.
I think discouraged is the best tool we have at this stage.
To make people realize, or students realize in this case as well, right? What is actually, you mentioned also ethics, like what is ethical to do? What is, as a professional, as a researcher, how should I use this tool? How should I approach these assignments?
Yeah, exactly. Like what's the actual goal of this? And the goal is not always the end result. And that's, I don't know, something to focus on.
Now, what I always like to ask teachers is to expand also my toolbox. What's AI tools you like to use, whether it's in teaching or generally in your job? That's
none.
You could share. None.
Yeah, I know it sounds silly, but I would be most, let's say, I would get the most out of something where I don't have to check if it's true. And the more I've seen, the more I realize that I don't really trust the factual side of it. And for anything else, I would prefer to do it myself. So I think there's a lot to be gained there. But I keep thinking that if it's, I always hope I can come up with something that is not just new to me but also new to the students in terms of an exercise or an experiment we can do. And I feel like if something's being trained on everything that's already being done, I don't trust it enough to come up with something that hasn't already been done.
Yeah, something truly new or original.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a silly approach because that also assumes that I know everything, and that's far from the truth. But I know from some colleagues who are exploring how to use prompting and how to use these large language models to find the intersections that give you something new, so that it might connect to fields or papers or researchers or concepts that are connected not by, let's say, the because they're connected all the time, but more by a sort of a creative prompting process. And the thing that I'm getting from these colleagues who are exploring it that way is that it's a giant amount of work. I've asked them, has this saved you any time? And so far, in the past 2 years, no. So if it's not going to save me time to do what I think it would be useful for, and I have to check everything that it says, whether it's true, so far I've not used it much. Maybe I've asked it to rephrase exam questions to be from open to multiple choice.
It's more like use it to sentence structuring and such.
Yeah, at best, which I think that, so for that course, which that's like once a year, that maybe I spend 2 days using it sparingly. Other than that, I'm relying on my computer remembering the passwords because I haven't logged in for a long time. Kind of, and maybe I've used it to see what my students would come up with if I asked them that. So it's sort of to test drive questions or to test drive assignments every now and then to get sort of a sense of how good does it sound, and to stay familiar with the tone, because that's the thing you keep hearing, that it has a specific tone of voice. But I think that's also kind of strange, because that means that whenever it doesn't have that tone of voice, you're trusting that it's not done by AI, which is probably not true.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I find it quite interesting that you ask students to use AI, like mandatorily. You're not using it that much. But I think what I understood, that because you make them reflect on it, maybe you try to teach them actually what you realize yourself, that you can really trust that output as much.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I want to make sure that they are aware that something that sounds good doesn't have to be true, which, generally is a truth beyond AI. But if they're going to be using it for so much, then at least, don't fool yourself into thinking that you don't have to check what comes out. So I can't guarantee that from then on, they'll fact check everything, but at least I know that they went through the process where they saw that there's a lot of stuff that needs changing. And the reflections consistently show that. There's never been a reflection on an introduction where the students say everything was just great. We checked everything and it was spot on. That's never happened. Never.
So based on your experience here in the classroom and also with AI and students using AI, what do you think, if you look at the bigger picture, what do you think universities often underestimate when it comes to using generative AI in education?
Probably how many students use it. Because, like I said before, if it's very clear, that doesn't mean that, that's the only cases. Some people have had plastic surgery done, and it's very clear. And then you can decide, I don't like plastic surgery. But that's only the cases when you've seen it, when you know it's there, because it's super obvious. But that's only a tip of the iceberg. If you use it and you build on it and you expand on it and you edit, then it becomes your own piece. and then it's hard to see. So I think there's more use, and probably proper and good, useful use than we know. And in terms of things that we underestimate, I think the speed with which students are adopting it versus how fast universities can adapt to this.
Yeah, I recently talked with multiple students, one even on a podcast, that indeed students, whether it is allowed or not, they like to, or they still use AI to certain degrees. But often what students feel is this uncertainty. What is the boundary of what is accepted, what is not, which is lacking a little bit, at least depending, of course, on faculty, university and such.
Yeah.
So what do you think, where should be boundary where the Gen AI tools are allowed to be used?
Well, the boring answer is it depends. And also the boundary is, I mean, the end goal is setting a boundary that makes sure students can separate thinking and writing. If writing is the main output, or designing a poster, or coming up with maybe an experiment design, if they put themselves out of the loop, then something's going wrong. But the way you ensure that the human and their learning is always in the loop differs so much. I think at EUC we have a policy that outlines 5 or 6 levels or approaches that you can use AI for. The first one being it's not allowed in any form. And then there's lots of varieties, like levels at which you can use it. So we're, for the first, I think since Quad 2, so this is since November, that every course has sort of a badge that explains what can you and what can you not do. But that still relies on the students adhering to that. You know, it's hard to police, it's hard to check, it's hard to fight people over it. And I don't think that's worth doing.
Before we talked, you showed me this sort of like a story of a calculator, right? As calculator came, the teachers were sort of like protesting or rebelling, like, now the students will forget how to do calculus by hand. And you can argue that we actually kind of forgot that we used calculators as a substitute. And I'm still surprised how fast the tools such as Gen AI progress in the last 20 years to help with writing. Do you think there will be still place for writing skills, or will we as teachers, educators, or students, will we not need them as much anymore? We will just dictate prompts to some machine that will write things for us.
I think it depends on whether what is written is also who reads it. I think for certain audiences, certain goals, writing skills are extremely important, but certain writing, like a description of a product in a catalog, I don't think anybody needs that skill, or that's not something that that's a problem if we lose it. But there are definitely still like writing. If it's about turning your own thoughts into writing, why put a model that's trained on all the other things that came before you between you and the words? You know, how much you can get closer to your own thoughts than by writing them down yourself.
Yeah, so it's like there's no intermediary, right, between that translates or creates more optimal phrasing.
Yeah, and I think having the need to translate your own thoughts into words, that's not for every goal, not for every purpose. It's not always important, but there are always going to be always going to be situations where that's key, and there I think it's necessary. Maybe fewer people will. I think the level at which the general population is adept at calculating or mental arithmetic or writing or speaking 7 languages also differs depending on what you do in life and what you need. And that stays the same, I think.
So as you mentioned, right, the role of AI in music and so like the maybe sometimes limited creativity that it leads to. How would you connect that back to writing? So students' outputs. Do you see that as well in their outcomes? That suddenly it's not as creative as it used to be.
So I'm not sure if creativity is the exact, let's say, parallel, but I think the ability to voice your own thoughts. So let's say that you wanted to paint a painting, but you get a box with just the 3 colors, and you have to make do with that. On the one hand, that's a constraint that can make you really creative. But I think if you have to express your thoughts just by using the words that have been written before, then they're being held back.
Yeah,
I think, and I don't know if people realize that. So in that sense, I think it pertains to creativity in a way, but more creativity in the sense of tapping into how close can you get to expressing what you think is the best way to express that thought or this theory. That's how I think it translates. I mean, this is coming from somebody with a quantitative life sciences background, so I don't think it applies to all the sciences. But speaking from my own experience, I think this is how it's holding students back, maybe without them realizing it.
Do you think then the writing is still the future, or should we just let go of writing and maybe instead see how they can express their thoughts maybe in a verbal or other way that might not be as easily supplemented by AI?
Well, I think writing complemented with visuals is still the best way that human brains can absorb information. And that's not something we can easily change. Like, our brains haven't evolved to adapt to the technology that we have. So we kind of have to work with how our brains work. And humans do a lot well visually, and complementing words and images, I think, is a strong thing. I've seen lots of really good animations that explain theories. I don't know if you're familiar with 3 blue, 1 brown. I think that's I always forget if it's 3 blue, 1 brown or 3 brown, 1 blue, but or Veritasium. There's a couple of YouTube channels that explain
I'm familiar with that one,
concepts with videos where words are carefully chosen, text on screen is carefully chosen, and visualizations support that. So you get all
aligned.
And sound, and you get all the channels sort of aligned. So in that sense, it's still going to be important. And I think all the things we just said about creativity, or you having, working with somebody else's tools or somebody else's thoughts, that applies to visuals as well.
I have a more personal question. I'm curious, what worries you about AI? If we look at the future, like maybe as a teacher or as a person?
I think that implies you are worried about something. Why would you ask? What worries you about AI?
What worries me about it?
Yeah.
Well,
since you brought it up.
Well, firstly, I see the possibility that people will rely more on AI output than their own output, what we also already discussed in a way. And then also, of course, replacement, right? That's I've watched some discussion about this already, also in the teaching sector. And I talked to a few students that say like, okay, ChatGPT or the other AI tool I'm using, the Notebook LM or whatever, can explain things better to me than a teacher.
Yeah.
Why do I need a teacher?
Yeah.
Why do I need to go to the lecture, to the class?
Yeah.
If the tool that can do it already verbally, in maybe a few years, you have the avatar or the hologram that will just teach everything that you need to know in a way that a teacher cannot.
And then everyone will be taught exactly the same thing in the same way. And I don't think that's helpful.
Probably not.
But how do you feel about what they say when, if you can be replaced by AI, then it wasn't a meaningful job to begin with? You've heard that before, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that means certain teachers don't have a meaningful job if they can be replaced.
Yeah, I think here in that question, currently, I definitely agree that.
Or it lost its meaning, maybe in the new context.
I think that question will lose its meaning once we reach the AI that is indistinguishable from human, even with like a human-like body, maybe even like a biological machine.
How do I know you're not a robot?
That is the good question. I might have been sent from the future to have this interview podcast with you to convince humans to use more AI.
Humans.
Yes. The past humans. Well, in a way, we are biological machines, right?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that in lots of ways, the way AI is designed, it's based on how we know brains work or cortical layers of brain tissue. So the parallel is pretty on the nose, I think. It's right there. I'm worried about the ethical side of AI. I'm worried about it making so much money that either the bubble bursts or people become so incredibly powerful and they're leveraging it for things that they shouldn't be leveraging for. We're promised, a shorter work week. We're promised better healthcare. We're not given that. And for those things, we don't need these large data centers that hog the water and the energy. And we don't need the people being paid peanuts to see all these horrible prompts.
Yeah.
It's a side we don't hear enough about. Somebody said, if you ask a question and that prompt has a certain cost, and then if you get an answer and you write back, thank you, the thing doesn't need to be thanked, but that's another prompt, another cost. If you think about how much
processing power, electricity, water.
Yeah, I mean, people should be given like an allowance of how much you can use it. Just the way, I don't know, energy sources or food can be rationed sometimes because they have no idea how much it's eating up the fabric of normal life for lots of people. That's what worries me. Yeah,
the changes. I've heard also that many younger generation or even my generation use AI pretty much as a Google. So they don't use Google anymore. They just ask it everything.
Yeah. Recipes. I mean, probably the first thing I ever tried is a hummus recipe.
Oh, okay. Was it a good recipe?
It was the most generic recipe you could think of. So, and I like that. So that's fine. But I don't know. It doesn't, it sounds so convincing. It convinced me and my brother that these were the amounts of coffee and water for when we were trying this experimental coffee machine, and the result was garbage.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of happy whenever it does a bad job as well.
Yeah, so it's like, okay.
I'm kind of hopeful because it means that all these people getting all these billions of money with all these promises don't really have anything to show for it except for this endless race. But, and when it comes to worry, I think that's it. Because when you say, the teacher can, or the LLM can explain it better than my teacher. Yeah, learned from your teacher, and maybe your teacher can have a bad day. Maybe your model doesn't have that. But we forget that everything it can do came out of us. So,
it based on the human knowledge, right?
Yeah, it didn't make up anything. And it also has no clue if something's true or not. It's not built for that. So, the worry thing triggered this kind of thoughts in me.
As we move slowly towards a conclusion, I want to ask a final question. And that's sort of a question directly answer directly to the listeners. What recommendation would you give to teachers listening right now or educators listening right now of how they can support students better in use of AI in writing?
Well, you already mentioned that it needs to be clear what they can do. So I think for an assignment, telling them where they're allowed and maybe why. I think that's helpful. And also, I think students have been using this way more than teachers. So I think teachers can help students by starting to use it and explore it, and try and see, to sort of bridge the gap between if you're an expert in your field and you use it, then the way that you view the output is really different from how a student views it. So sort of comparing the view of an expert versus the view of a student to how a student uses it and how an expert uses it. So maybe using it together somehow so that students can hear what you think of the output. So let's say that as a teacher, you say, look, I asked it to do this, and then I completely filleted the output because this happens. And then see to what extent students who aren't an expert treat the output. Like where are their blind spots? Something like that. So I think the main one is that teachers should be using it more, even though I had just admitted I don't use it that much.
Well, you're using it in your courses.
True, but I think I'm using it because I tried it out and realized, if students are using this, then and I won't know, then what value is your diploma going to be if we don't, acknowledge this? So I think a lot of teachers have tried avoiding to use it, and them using it also informs them how to change their assignments, meaning they can inform their students better and they can adapt the assignments to be still valuable in assessing critical thinking.
Yeah, to see how to incorporate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I think very valuable lesson also for myself to see how can I incorporate it more.
Happy to be here. Happy to help.
So thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, everybody listening. You might be wondering, okay, where can I find out other podcast episodes? And you can go to eur.nl/podcast or your other favorite podcast platform. And if you want to also see us, you can also go to YouTube, where you can find this podcast also with a video recording. And if you're looking to more support of how to use AI in writing, look in the description of this podcast. We will include some links that might be helpful for that. So thank you very much all for listening. Thank you for Community for Learning and Innovation of Erasmus University for making this podcast happen. And I'll see you in the next episode.